Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the American Chambers joining us from over 50 countries today. I think many of you know me. I'm Myron Brilliant. I'm the Executive Vice President in charge of International Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I'll be joined momentarily by Neil Bradley, who is the Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategy. And frankly, all the problems that we are dealing with in Washington are on the feet and head of Neil Bradley. I'm looking forward to the conversation this morning. The title says AmCham pre-election briefing. This is not about AmChams and their elections. This is about the Congress of the United States, the midterm elections, and what we're likely to see. What's the impact on business? How does it impact the international agenda? And of course, how does it portray for the business community's agenda going forward? And Neil is at the center of all these issues. So I'm looking forward to the conversation this morning. I want to just thank all of you for joining. You're such important partners of the U.S. Chamber. We've come through crisis together, through the pandemic. We've stayed in touch. And I am really pleased that this year we finally have had an opportunity to re-engage with many of the AmChams in person. Rather than just virtual settings like this, which are important to stay connected to, we've had the opportunity to travel back to your countries, and we've had the opportunity to receive AmCham delegations here in Washington. I look forward to more of that this fall and obviously into next year. And I just want to thank the whole Chamber team led by Suzanne Clark for really wanting to look at how we can expand our partnerships with the American Chambers abroad. And we welcome your ideas, your thoughts at any time. Look, this is a moment of great uncertainty in the global economy, geopolitical risk, whether it's the tensions in the U.S.-China relationship that have no limit at this time, unfortunately, or whether it's issues around the theater of war in Ukraine, the unprovoked aggression of Russia. Think about the impact that's having on food security, energy security around the world. Of course, we're also dealing with global inflation. Here in the United States, we're not immune to it, but we see it all over the world. Neil will have some views on that. And we're dealing with, therefore, rising debt levels, a stronger dollar, rising debt levels in emerging economies. There's a lot on our plate. Of course, at the U.S. Chamber, we have many issues we focus on. One of the areas is international economic engagement. And I would just say at the outset, it's a mixed bag. We're pleased to see the progress on IPAF, the Pacific Economic Framework. It's something we have supported. We're glad that USTR and Commerce are moving forward. We're glad to be part of that consultation process. We still think that having these countries as part of an umbrella engagement strategy in the United States is critical. Of course, we're concerned that there isn't market access on the table, and therefore, how do we move the trade pillar forward? But we're working on all the issues, supply chains and other issues that are covered in IPAF. And having a stronger digital framework in the region is critical as well. We're also advancing our EU-US relations at this time. We're part of the TTC process. We've been a consistent advisor into that, working with both the US and EU governments. And we're partners, obviously, in all these endeavors with the AmChams in Europe, as well as, of course, in Asia through IPAF. On trade tariff liberalization, frankly, we haven't seen enough. We're going to continue to fight for tariff exclusions, and we're going to continue to ask the administration to do more on that front. I think this is critical that we stay on that, particularly at a time of high inflation. Why do we want to have a penalty for imports that are helping American consumers? So this has been a front and center issue that Suzanne Clark, our president and CEO, Neil Bradley, myself, John Murphy, many others at the Chamber have talked about consistently. And I know that the issue lies at the desk of President Biden, but we have more work to continue to engage not only the administration, but the Congress. We're sitting on trade agreement negotiations. Why haven't we moved ahead with the UK, one of our principal partners on many levels? Why aren't we moving ahead? We have a new government in the UK, Liz Truss, someone who has been to the United States to visit with the U.S. Chamber and our business committee. Why don't we move ahead with UK-US free trade negotiations? Similarly, why aren't we making a bigger road into Africa through the US-Kenya free trade negotiations? We're very pleased that the administration has asked us at times to be a very principal partner with them on major endeavors. I think back to the Summit of Americas in June of this year, where the U.S. Chamber was asked to be a principal partner of pulling together the business agenda. And we have this similar role coming up in December when we host the Africa Business Summit, that President Biden has invited all these leaders from Africa, and the United States Chamber of Commerce will be a principal partner in the business activity. We want to hear from you on all these issues. We're encouraged in some areas, but we're also concerned that we're not going far enough to show U.S. leadership at a critical time. Overriding all this, or overseeing all this, is, of course, the U.S. Chamber's continued advocacy efforts in Washington, around this country, and, of course, globally. And I'm very pleased that despite all the challenges we face on energy and climate, on trade policy, on immigration issues, on a range of other issues around the pandemic, on talent, that one person who's been at the center of this storm in a good way is Neil Bradley. And as I said, Neil is one of the most strategic thinkers in Washington, brings a wealth of experience from Capitol Hill, and of course has been the chief policy advisor, leader of the U.S. Chamber now for years. And I'm glad to bring him on for this discussion and look forward to our back and forth. And of course, if you have questions, we welcome those questions. Please enter it into the chat line, and we'll take those questions up in a few minutes. Neil, I want to bring you on now, and thank you for participating. You are such an important player in Washington, and I don't say that often about people, but I do about you, Neil. And I want to just start with a broader framework around some of the international issues that we think about. First off, the politics of trade. There are people around this call today who work for companies, who sit on AmJam boards, who are wondering, why is the United States sitting on the sidelines when we should be asserting leadership at a time the U.S. is needed? And you look at the Congress and the makeup in the Congress and the dynamics we face before the midterms, and we'll get to the midterms. Where do you see the Congress's mood on trade right now? And how are the two parties looking at these issues, and why can't we get more done? What's your thoughts on that front?
Well, Myron, first, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on with our colleagues from around the globe. On the trade politics, I believe for probably the better part of 2+ decades that there was a real misunderstanding around the domestic politics of trade. There was always this sense that trade was with voters somehow overwhelmingly unpopular and difficult, therefore, for politicians to advance. The polling never quite truly bore that out. This is more of a myth than a reality. And even when you dug in underneath the surface and you talked to voters who may have not had the most favorable view of trade and of trade agreements, one of the things that you would find is that it had very low intensity. So people had maybe opinions about trade, and in some instances unfavorable opinions, but they didn't tend to vote on it. It didn't swing elections. It was never the most important issue for a voter. It was never even in the top 5 or 10 list in most instances for the issues that move voters. In some ways, we took advantage of that kind of lack of intensity amongst voters to allow our elected officials who were free trade advocates to be able to move agreements through the Congress. What we saw, however, over the last this current administration and the prior administration is that when the elected leaders, when the administration, when the leaders on the Hill don't have any interest in doing a trade agreement, there's no natural constituency amongst the voting populace to force them to take up the trade agenda. So in other words, without someone kind of leading the parade to try to get something done on the elected official side, there's just a lack of momentum. So I think that's why the work that you just referenced a moment ago, Myron, of kind of gearing up the business community's efforts to light a fire under elected officials, both in the administration and the Congress, is going to be so important. Because if we don't do it, it's not going to come from the voting populace, and it's not going to come from anywhere else. So I'm actually not concerned about the politics of trade writ large. I am concerned about the lack of leadership and what we can do to try to create some momentum for new leadership on trade.
Neil, when we talk about the midterms and the aftermath, I might ask you to elaborate a little bit about whether you see either party leaning more forward. Does this give time for the administration to be more bold? Do the Republicans if they take over the House? But we'll get to that in a second. There are very few issues in Washington that are bipartisan. One could argue U.S.-China relations has a bipartisan stake. Everyone is concerned about China's rise and how to manage some of their policies, whether it's in the economic sphere or the geopolitical and security sphere. But I want to talk about Ukraine and Russia. This is an area where there has been bipartisan support when it comes to making sure there's adequate funding. After all, the United States has provided almost 90% of the funding in this war. But, as the war progresses, we've seen a counteroffensive by Ukraine that's promising, but there's no short-term end here, right? This is going to carry forward. As we get into sort of the next 2 years, do you see any reduction of support coming out of the Congress? It's been an area where there has been bipartisanship, but we're moving quickly into a 24 cycle. So how do you see this playing out in the Congress, support for Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that it is not, the tier one topic that it was back in the spring and amongst rank and file members and elected officials. So, in some ways, it's moved. The conflict has moved off many of the front pages of the newspapers in the United States. It's kind of moved off much of the lead in the news coverage, and in the middle of an election season, therefore, candidates aren't spending as much time talking about it. That said, to contrast the support for Ukraine with what I just talked about with trade, there is enormous bipartisan support amongst the elected leaders in the House and the Senate, obviously the administration, to keep supporting Ukraine. So I don't think that the fact that it may not be the top of the news every day in the United States is in any way going to diminish the actual aid that the United States supplies, particularly military aid that the United States supplies over the next 2 years in the new Congress. Look at Leader McConnell, the Republican leader in the U.S. Senate, and the president. This is when they're fighting over COVID aid, as they are additional COVID relief money and COVID money in the United States, and can't come to an agreement. The one issue they immediately say that they're going to do and they have agreement on is additional assistance for Ukraine, and that's not going to change.
Neil, we're fighting challenges around the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia war, which is high energy prices. And of course, sometimes it gets blended into climate discussion, but they're separate issues. We've called for increasing domestic production. Where does the chamber stand on just generally how we deal and combat high energy prices? They're going back up again in the United States. Obviously, this is a concern around the world as well. What's your thoughts and reflections here?
Yeah, as I was driving in this morning, I was listening to Squawk Box, and they had a Democratic congressman on who was talking about that there actually is agreement amongst Republicans and Democrats on the near-term need for additional energy production, oil and gas production in the United States. But maybe there was a difference over long-term and the pace of the energy transition. And then this Democratic member of the House made an interesting point to clarify what he meant by near term. And he said, well, production in the next year. And I think that the fundamental difference that we see going on is that if you are an energy company and you're going to make an investment in a new oil well, new domestic gas production, new transmission pipelines to get the gas and the oil to the places it needs to go to be utilized and to be refined, if you make that investment today, you're not going to recoup that investment in the next 12 months, that this is a more medium-term play. And so that the time horizons between Democrats and Republicans, between advocates on both sides, tend to be off a little bit. We tend to come down that it's going to take longer than a year or 2 or 5 to make the energy transition that we need to make. And so it's important that in the medium term, that we expand our domestic energy production, oil and gas here in the United States, so that we're not caught in a lurch in the midst of that transition. So, the real fear, if you're a company, is that you end up with stranded assets, that you make an enormous investment that you can't recoup. The truth is that we need a policy platform that acknowledges the fact that we're going to be using oil and gas for the medium term and even longer. And so that those additional investments can be recouped, and companies should be encouraged and mainly allowed to make them. So we can have both an energy transition, as Suzanne says, we're a sophisticated country. We can do two things at the same time. We can invest in and begin making the energy transition to get where we want to get to go in carbon reduction, and we can at the same time make the investments in oil and gas that we need to meet our energy needs and some of the energy needs of the world in both the near and medium term.
Neil, just one follow up here. There's no certainty that we'll get the support we want from the Middle East for increasing exports.
OPEC's decision yesterday.
This is an OPEC decision. Clearly, that helps us with our advocacy with the Biden administration. But there's a lot of pressure from the left on this issue. Do you see any real nuanced change from the administration? I sense there is, but maybe not as far as we want it to go. What's your thoughts?
I think there has been. I think it is nuanced. It has not gone as far. Frankly, let's be clear. Some of it's come under pressure from their own party. Take the Inflation Reduction Act. This was the bill that the president signed, I guess, a little over a month ago. This was kind of the ultimate culmination of his Build Back Better proposal. Included some tax increases, unfortunately, on the business community, but lots of investments in clean energy and the transition. One of the provisions that hasn't been reported very widely, that Senator Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, demanded as part of the deal and was able to extract it because they needed his vote, was a requirement that the administration proceed with certain oil and natural gas lease sales, including some ones that in the past they had halted, that they had to reopen. And in fact, they have since reopened those. They awarded the permits or the lease sales in the last month, and that's moving apace. So they are making some movement. Some of it's of their own volition. Some of it's a result of that legislation passed by Congress. But either way, it's still not enough to meet the moment that we're in to address our energy needs.
Neil, we're always careful as an institution on issues around Fed rate hikes. So we're very careful how we manage our public position. You're part of that. We're at a 20-year high for the dollar, right? I mean, at one point, the dollar and the pound were almost 1-to-1. That's great if you want to buy something in London, not so great if you want to export from the United States. Are we seeing an increasing pressure from our member companies in addressing this high dollar, and whether you see the administration, Congress beginning to understand the impact that could have on the health of our economy over time?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the pound sterling and the dollar. I mean, we plumbed historic lows, and not like historic 20 or 40-year lows in terms of parity, like 2-century lows, like right, since the creation of the dollar. And so, it's gone back up to some more normal levels, but that was a warning sign. Yes, we are clearly beginning to hear more about it. I think it's important to kind of understand some of the context behind why this is happening. Often when we have interest rate moves amongst central banks, whether that's bringing interest rates up or bringing interest rates down in response to global contraction, fear of recession, we talk about coordinated activity amongst the central banks. And that's something that's not happening as much in this interest rate rise period for a pretty simple and understandable reason. All countries are experiencing inflation. Inflation is at near 40-year highs, generally across the board. But the relative strength of economies globally varies significantly today. And so in the United States, where we have historic generational low unemployment. We still have strong balance sheets for consumers. Consumers are 70% plus of the U.S. economy. The work that the Federal Reserve has to do in terms of raising interest rates to reduce demand, to quail inflation, is significantly more than, say, the central bank in Europe or central banks in Asia, where the underlying economy isn't quite as strong, and more minor increases in interest rates are likely to reduce demand significant to begin gaining a control on inflation. So that's, you see the Federal Reserve, for example, moving 75 basis points, and the EU, the Bank of England, moving 50 basis points, within a week of each other, as a reflection of the relative strengths. When they do that, you create this dollar foreign currency discrepancy. And so that's a long way of saying, yes, we are hearing about it, but the predominant need to quell inflation in the United States and to get it under control and to avoid it becoming embedded across the economy, I think is going to kind of trump any concerns in the near term about dollar exchange rates, and that we're going to have to weather some really several months, a year or so, of a really strong dollar relative to other currencies until we get inflation under control and can rebalance this.
We keep hearing that inflation, in a year might be a much lower number. Maybe it's at 3%. We'll see. But the impact of a strong dollar, of course, is not only on exporters, but also on emerging economies who are having higher debt levels and having a hard time making payments. So I just want to remind everyone out there, we're very sensitive to it, but I think Neil gave you a rationale for why the Fed is moving the way it is and what we're hearing from our member companies. Neil, I know everyone wants to hear about the midterms. And so I want to give you a two-part question, and then we'll talk about what the impact of the midterms will be. What do you think are going to be the burning issues that are driving the midterm elections? Obviously, we have high inflation, challenges in our economy, a shortage of talent. We have issues around, frankly, around what we do in Ukraine. And then on the social side, we have, no question, the abortion issue out there. So there are social and economic issues that will impact the election. We have another wild card, and it's called Trump. And so I wonder if you want to just comment on what you think is going to motivate voter turnout and how this all is going to play out in your view.
It looks very different depending on whether you're talking to a Republican voter or a Democratic voter. Most voters today have sorted themselves into one or the other. There are very few swing voters in the United States anymore, even independents, and there are a lot more people who call themselves independents or register as independents in the United States. The vast majority of them have a tendency to always vote Republican or always vote Democrat. And so it can be a little bit of a misnomer when you see those RD-I splits in voter registration. If you're talking to a Republican voter today or an independent who tends to vote Republican, what you're going to hear is inflation in the economy, border security, crime, and really moving quickly up into the issue set, education and what kids are taught in schools, and schools being open, which was obviously a major issue during the pandemic. If you go talk to a Democratic voter or a leaning Democrat independent, you will hear some talk of inflation in the economy. It remains a top issue, but it doesn't have the intensity. It's not polling in the top position. You're more likely to hear about climate change and environmental issues. You will absolutely hear about abortion and reproductive issues on Democratic voters' minds. You still tend to hear about healthcare issues as part of inflation and costs in the economy. And so both sides, and you hear on Democratic voters' minds a lot about Trump and their concern about Trump. And so there's not a whole lot of overlap between those two issue sets. And so Republican candidates are talking about one set of issues, and often Democratic candidates are talking about a very different set of issues.
Well, we're not into forecasting who's going to win, but we are into scenario planning. And so what happens in the midterms has some impact, obviously, for the next 2 years. There are a few issues that I can see where the U.S. Congress will unite in a bipartisan way between the midterms and, of course, 2024. But can you think of areas where there could be bipartisanship coming out of this Congress, just no matter who wins the House and no matter who wins the Senate? And what's the agenda the Biden administration is likely to pursue if they retain one of those two houses? What do you see is on their list? And then we'll get to what you see from the Republican side.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a real question of whether you have divided government or unified government. Today we have unified government. Yes, we're not in the business of making predictions, but we are in the business of understanding trends in history. And I often tell folks who ask that if all you told me was that this was a midterm election in a president's first term in office, meaning the president got elected 2 years ago for the first time, this is their first midterm election, I could say confidently that the president's party currently controls both houses of Congress, and the president's party is almost certain to lose control of the House of Representatives in the midterm election, and the Senate is a toss-up depending on which states are in play, which, by the way, happens to be the exact scenario that we're in today. The reason I would be confident in saying that is that is the modern pattern. Every president since Bill Clinton in 1992 has began their first term in office with unified control of government. And every president since Bill Clinton has promptly lost that majority in the ensuing midterm election, with the one exception being the quirk of 2002, which was a quirk because of 9/11 and some of the national unity after 9/11. And because actually in the middle of that first 2 years of President Bush's term, there was a party switcher in the Senate who, in the middle of it, changed control between Democrats and Republicans. So excluding that, this is a pattern that just holds universally, whether it's Obama or Trump, and I think it's going to hold under Biden. In divided government, heading into a president's re-election scenario, there tends to be very little that gets done. The Congress and the president tend to focus on the things that they have to do. What do they have to do? They have to fund the government. They have to keep it opening, keep employees paid, keep the checks going out. They have to deal with the statutory debt limit, which is this kind of weird artificial cap that dates back a century on how much debt the U.S. government can issue, and that has to be updated periodically. And then after that, it's about, are there any issues where they might be able to kind of find bipartisan agreement? A key issue that we think could fit that bill in divided government is a response to China. And so things that are dealing with China, both economically and from a national security perspective, I think are going to be high on the list of what a divided government could get done. If the president's party, if I'm wrong, if history is defied and the president's party maintains unified control of government, then I think it's really going to be a situation in which he continues pursuing the agenda of the last 2 years, where he goes back to do some of the things on energy and climate and more income transfers that they tried to get done over the last 2 years, but haven't gotten across the finish line.
I want to remind the audience, if you've got questions, this is a great time to let us know what those questions are. We'll get to your questions shortly. Neil, I want to come back to a couple points you made. One is, of course, it does matter what the outcome of the elections is on how Congress pursues an agenda, or how does the administration. The administration is pursuing an agenda that is more and more through executive action. Are there areas that we should be concerned about where perhaps the administration is going a lone approach, is going to be perhaps in contrast to the way that the U.S. Chamber and the Business Committee wants to see the agenda move forward? What's your thoughts about that? And then two, if the Republicans do take over the House and pursue a policy that's maybe more populist than we're used to seeing out of Republican-led Congress, how does the business community and the chamber address that and manage that?
Yeah, so to take the first one, Myron, on the regulatory side, that's the other pattern of modern American politics, is that when the president's party loses unified control of government and are in divided government, they turn to regulations. President Obama, I think, did us all a favor and put it very succinctly when Republicans took control of Congress and he became frustrated about what he couldn't get done. He said, famously, "I've got a pen and I've got a phone." And that was his way of saying, I'm just going to do it through regulation and executive action. Of course, the problem with that is that when Trump got elected and when Trump lost control of Congress, the Republicans lost control of Congress, he said, I got the same pen and I got the same phone, so I'm going to go in the exact opposite direction. Of course, President Biden has the exact same tools again, and so it really creates this pendulum. We tend to historically focus on that pendulum where you're really talking about a lot of energy, environmental policies. You tend to be talking about procurement and labor policies, particularly out of the Department of Labor. Think about things like overtime pay, unionization rules that do tend to flip back and forth. There is a new area that President Biden's team and the administration, and frankly, Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren from Massachusetts, and many of her allies who have now taken positions running key agencies in the administration are focused on, and that is brand new. And that has to do with antitrust and competition policies. Since the 1970s, mid 1970s, Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan, we've actually had a pretty bipartisan consensus amongst policymakers in the United States around the role of antitrust and government regulation. We adopted something called the Consumer Welfare Standard that said the basis for judging whether a merger or an acquisition was monopolistic or anti-competitive was a question of whether or not it ended up hurting consumers. And if it didn't end up hurting consumers, then there was no role for the government to intervene. We also took the position that deregulation was the best way to allow for competitions amongst large platforms. In the 1970s, if you got on an airplane in the United States, it was the federal government who had decided what route that plane would fly, between what cities, and how much your seat would cost on that plane. It was a completely regulated industry. The same was true for railroads. The same was true for trucking. The same was true for banking. The same was true for long distance and local telecommunications. We deregulated all of that, and I think we benefited from that deregulation, the competition it has spurred. There are some folks led by Lina Khan at the FTC, Rohit Chopra at the CFPB, who disagreed with that decision back in the 1970s, along with Elizabeth Warren, who want to reverse that. They want to re-regulate large platform companies, anyone who's an intermediary in the economy, finance, telecommunications, the internet, as, quote, common carriers. And they've said they want to re-regulate them like we used to regulate railroads. And so that is a very different threat that we're keenly focused on.
So we are very focused, obviously, and Neil's been at the center of this, but we have also an Institute for Legal Reform and, of course, the Litigation Center. And we see a much more active litigation center at the U.S. Chamber, partly because of what we see coming out of the administration. Speak to the impact that our litigation center has in this area of regulation. I think our audience doesn't always know, the AmChams don't always appreciate. And I'm going to ask you about political endorsements after, but this is an area I think is not well understood by the AmCham community.
Yeah, when you think about your response to regulatory overreach, you really have to rely on the courts, because remember, this regulatory overreach is tending to take place in periods of divided government. So Congress could pass something overturning what regulation the administration's doing, but the president's never going to sign that. He's never going to undo what he has done. And so you can't really use the legislative process to reverse a lot of these regulatory moves. But you can use the courts, and we've been quite effective in using the courts. We have close to an 80% win record in cases that ultimately get to the Supreme Court. We're involved in litigation at the district court level, at the appellate court level, ultimately at the Supreme Court. And they've created some pretty significant precedents over the last several years that put guardrails around what administrative agencies can do. There was just a decision recently called the Major Questions Doctrine that really calls into question many of kind of the most out of bounds issues that regulators are currently pursuing. The only problem with that is that at the moment we have some leads of regulatory agencies who don't mind going and fighting it out in court, even if they are likely to lose. That's a new dynamic. Most regulators hated the idea of taking a weak position into court. Several of them now say that that's a badge of honor. Lena Khan has famously said, I don't mind kind of going to court and losing. It proves that the law is fundamentally flawed. The problem, of course, that creates is businesses are stuck in this limbo while the court process gradually comes to its ultimate conclusion. So even if business is vindicated, even if the chamber is vindicated through our litigation center, there's a lot that is lost in the process.
Neil, uncertainty is the one thing I can assure you business leaders do not like, whether they live in the United States or they live abroad. And this is an area where we do have some uncertainty. We're getting a number of questions in about the chamber's political endorsement process, and frankly, what midterm races do you likely see are most important and which ones we're following? Because AmChams often get confused about our political program versus, say, their role. And let me be clear up front, what endorsements we do make or go through a rigorous process internally through our stakeholders. We have a political action group. In no way do they have any ties or affiliations with the American chambers, and that has always been the case. But since that sometimes comes up, I want to address that. Neil, you might want to address that as well. But I just want to ask you to talk a little bit about our endorsement process this fall and what races we're watching and why we're watching these critical midterm races, both in the House and the Senate.
Yeah, let me start with the latter part, the races that we're watching. The easiest place to start is the U.S. Senate. The Senate, of course, is 50-50 right now. Democrats have the majority by virtue of Vice President Harris's tie-breaking vote. Republicans are having to defend a lot of key seats this cycle, particularly because of retirements. So North Carolina, Ohio, in particular, are two key seats, along with Wisconsin, that Republicans need to hold on to. Pennsylvania is the biggest wild card. Pat Toomey, a Republican, has retired, so that is now an open seat. Pennsylvania is the Republican-held seat that is most likely at the moment to flip to the Democratic side. If nothing else changed other than Pennsylvania, that would obviously give Democrats a 51-49 seat edge. But there are some seats that Democrats have to hold on to as well. The two most notable, first is Nevada, where Adam Laxalt, the Republican former Attorney General, is challenging the incumbent. Laxalt has been up or down within the margin of error for the last several months, and that is a key pickup opportunity for Republicans. And then, of course, Georgia. Georgia is an interesting race. It's gotten lots of attention because of Herschel Walker and Senator Warnock, who's the Democratic incumbent. Georgia continues to have a runoff system where if you don't get 50% on election day, you go to a runoff. If I were betting today, I think that Georgia race could go to a runoff, which would occur in December. And so depending on what happens in Nevada and Pennsylvania, you could have the single election that makes the difference between whether it's a 50-50 Senate or 51-49, one way or the other, being the Georgia runoff in December. The House races were down to about 30 toss-up races kind of across the country that will determine the outcome. Republicans are currently leading in most of those toss-up races within the margin of error or so. Given current trajectories, I think the historical trend line of 75-80% of toss-up races going to the party out of power will likely hold, and that's obviously more than enough to give Republicans the majority in the House.
Well, I want to ask you if you want to comment on our endorsement process.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want you to comment on is the Florida governor race.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see that race is tightened. And of course,
Yeah,
everyone's watching that because that has national implications. You want to comment on both the governor's race and our political endorsement?
Let me comment on our endorsement process. You said it very well, Myron. We have a first. When we endorse a candidate, we speak only for ourselves. We don't speak for AmChams. We don't speak for state or local chambers. We don't even speak individually for each of our members. We have a process that we go through that involves candidate interviews. We've interviewed over 150 candidates for congressional office this cycle. We review voting records, whether they're a current incumbent or if they're in the state legislature, for example, what they've done. They fill out questionnaires about what their agenda is and position on issues. And then we check their relationships with the business community wherever they're from. Do they work with the state chamber? Do they work with the local chamber? And so we are not a partisan organization. We don't endorse only Republicans or only Democrats. We make judgment calls based on the individual candidates in a race and what we think will help us achieve our policy objectives over the near and medium term. So it is a rigorous process. These things do go before a vote of a select committee of our members at the U.S. Chamber that's pretty diverse. But the goal is to support champions of the chamber and champions of the business community, and to ensure that we have allies in the House and the Senate on the Republican and Democratic side of the aisle that can help us advance good legislation and stop bad legislation. The Florida's governor's race has tightened, yes. Governor DeSantis running against former Republican Governor Charlie Crist, who switched parties, became a Democrat, got elected to Congress, has now left Congress, is running for his old job as governor, but this time as a Democrat. I'm not terribly surprised by the tightness of it. Popular wisdom has come to think of Florida as not much of a swing state anymore. It still has lots of swing state elements to it. It's experiencing pretty significant population growth as people are moving into the state from the northern United States, from Puerto Rico, from other parts. And so it's always going to be a pretty close race for a statewide office in Florida. By the way, Senator Rubio, who's running for re-election there, likely to win, but his race is also tightened up. I just think it's the nature of Florida.
Neil made a number of important points. I just want to come back to one, which is that the Chamber's agenda is a business agenda, a pro-growth agenda. Create jobs, strengthen our economy, work with stakeholders, regardless of what party they're in, whether they're at the federal, state level, and of course, overseas, we engage governments as well. And that's our agenda at the end of the day. And our work in the political arena is to promote a pro-business, pro-growth agenda, create jobs in our economy. And so just remind everyone who watches the news and hears stories about the pressure on the business community, whether it's big business, whether it's the Business Roundtable or the U.S. Chamber, the mission of the U.S. Chamber is a clear one. And as long as we stay on that mission under Suzanne's leadership, with Neil's guidance and others, we're in a good place, and that's where we are. Andy Hunter, thank you for your comments from AmCham Ukraine. Andy, yes, the Chamber remains very committed to working on the issues around Ukraine, supporting you. As you know, we just hosted a forum this week where I interviewed the ambassador to the United States, Markarova, and talked about the strong business support for Ukraine and the work we're going to continue to do around reconstruction. You heard Neil earlier talk about the fact that this is one of the few issues where there's been bipartisanship. I think Neil emphasized that we'll continue to see that. And I think that's right. I think we will continue to see the Congress act in a way that is supportive of supporting Ukraine's not only counteroffensive, but in the end of the day, eliminating the threat of Russia in its territory. And I think the United States government understands that America's leadership is being tested, but frankly, there's a lot more at stake than just America's leadership. So I think the will is there, and I think Neil emphasized that. So thank you for your positive comments, and thank you for your strong support. Neil, there's a question here about, I hate the name Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. I don't know how you feel about that name, but that name, in Europe and elsewhere, people are saying, is this the beginning of an increasing anti-trade protectionist sentiment in the United States? Part of that rests on perhaps new policies around our investment in the semiconductor industry, the CHIP Act. And we have been very supportive because we do need to make investments in critical sectors of our economy, even as we continue to have a robust trade agenda. You want to comment a little bit about what the IRA stood for? We had some concerns about it, but ultimately where we are as a business community and where you see things in Congress and the administration.
Yeah, you're right, Myron. We did have some concerns, particularly around the tax side, a new domestic book minimum tax, which is really complicated and hard to administer, as well as a tax on capital flows through stock repurchases that we object to. I think the question really points to this question of some of the tax incentives for electric vehicles, for new clean energy production that were included in the IRA. Senator Manchin insisted that for many of those provisions to qualify for the tax incentive or the tax credit, that some combination of critical minerals, manufacturing, final assembly had to take place, and it varies depending on the provision. But in some instances in North America, in other instances in North America, or in a country in which the U.S. has a free trade agreement, and so a lot of those provisions have appropriately, those restrictions have appropriately been called into question as to whether or not they violate our obligations under the WTO and under various trade agreements. And so that has become an issue, a point of contention. I caution a little bit into overreading the fact that that got enacted as some kind of wholesale change in the approach of Congress. This was a bill that they essentially had 48 senators. They needed 50 senators. They had 48 senators on board. They had 49 on board with the energy provisions. That included Senator Sinema. They did not have Senator Manchin on board. And so he really drove a lot of these provisions. He very much has a philosophy that says that we need to build North American and United States capacity in critical minerals and manufacturing to take advantage of these. I suspect that what flexibility the administration has in the regulatory process, they may seek to utilize. And there's already discussions, even amongst Democrats on Capitol Hill, about figuring out ways to modify some of those provisions to address some of the very legitimate trade concerns. And so I think to that specific piece of legislation, stay tuned. I think there could be more to come here, but the questioner is right in raising this issue.
So I thought, Neil, you handled that very well. I think there is a broader question around industrial policy that's emerging because, frankly, Europe is not innocent in this space, nor is China and other major markets. But I do think that Neil has outlined that we shouldn't overstate what took place in the IRA. And we also should recognize that the role of the U.S. Chamber has always been to promote and push for WTO consistency in any laws that we adopt. And we'll continue to be advocates for an open trading system. Be assured of that, even as there are politics underlying these bills. And even as Neil outlined, this was really pretty much a party vote at the end of the day. Neil, I wanted to just end with two final questions. One is you referenced China. One of the outcomes of this election, regardless of who wins, could be a unified voice around even being tougher on China. we're starting to see some action in the administration around export controls and outbound restrictions. But Congress might try to outdo whatever the administration does. So this is one worry and concern of the business community. The notion of constructive pragmatism in the U.S.-China relationship is on short supply. Your thoughts on that, and how likely we'll see some unified voices regardless of who wins. Certainly if the House flips, we'll see that. And then my second question then kind of bleeds into that more broadly, which is, we've seen elements of the Democratic Party go more left and more progressive. We've seen more elements of the Republican Party, particularly in the House, go more populist. How do we change that narrative? How do we bring the parties back together? If you look back to early parts of your career, I certainly remember early parts of my career working with Democrats and Republicans on trade issues. Can we get back to that? How do we get back to that? What's the role of the business committee and the chamber in particular to push that?
Yeah. So, on the first on China, there's something you said in your question I think it's really important, because I think it's the takeaway here, which is kind of this sense of one-upsmanship, that it is, I think, quite possible that we see in divided government kind of this sense of a competition between the two parties about who can appear the toughest with respect to China. Sometimes that will lead to constructive policies that can help us deal with the very real issues that exist. In other times, that competition can mean that we kind of lose sight of practical implications and real world impacts of policies where the return, the benefit, is far less than the actual cost of the policy, and so we get out of weight with respect to the cost benefit. And so if there's an issue that we're watching closely, I think it's this concern that in domestic politics, one-upsmanship gets us off of constructive policy that can actually move the needle, and maybe into some policies that make good political sound bites, but don't actually deal with the real issues that we're trying to confront. Of course, this populism, progressivism, this is a reality. There is a larger growing progressive element within the Democratic Party in the United States, and a larger growing populist movement within the Republican Party. The progressives don't yet dominate the Democratic Party, and populists don't yet dominate the Republican Party. But there's significant factors that weigh in on the folks who tend to be more traditional center-left Democrats or traditional center-right Republicans. Part of what adds fuel to the fire on both the populist right and the progressive left is this intense polarization and kind of party splitting. The idea that that the other party poses an existential threat to the things that you particularly value, and we're seeing that rise on both sides. So we think it's important. The things we're working on at the U.S. Chamber is to really do two things. One, to turn down that temperature on the idea that either party is kind of an existential threat. We have operated really since, really for most of U.S. history, but certainly is the case since World War II, in a world in which we lived between the 40-yard lines. For football fans, center field, 40-yard line, one side's left of center, one side's right of center, but you kind of stayed within those guardrails. And people might prefer to be right of center or left of center, but both sides benefited from those guardrails and benefited from the constructive engagement between those on the left side and the right side to argue over where we were going to get placed. We host bipartisan conversations all the time at the U.S. Chamber, trying to reestablish those guardrails between elected Democrats and elected Republicans to demonstrate that even when they disagree, they can accept fundamental principles that are core to preserving those guardrails. It's also, in addition, incredibly important that we equally push back on what the negative impact of populism is and of progressivism is, and that we reaffirm kind of these basic tenets that both sides can accept around free enterprise, around free trade, about the importance of making these decisions through a democratic process, of accepting the results even when you don't like them in a legislative battle or in a court battle, and kind of reaffirming those traditional norms. And so I'm not going to pretend it's not an easy situation, that it's an easy situation. It's not. It's a brand new challenge. I think it's a challenge that none of us, at least in the United States, have really faced in our careers. And so we have to get really creative about how we try to manage that. It's the reason that we host the Common Ground series. It's the reason that we reward lawmakers when they engage with members of the other party on issues. That gets you points with the U.S. Chamber, and we publicly recognize that. We have to create those norms, recreate those norms to hopefully reestablish that working middle, recreate those guardrails, and suppress the negative impacts of progressivism and populism.
Neil, I'm glad you made that last point. I think it's really important to emphasize that we are rewarding members who cross over the aisle and work together on bipartisan legislation. And I think that's been an emphasis of the policy that under Neil and Suzanne and others at the chamber. Neil, real quickly, very quickly, before we run out of time, there's a question on immigration in Latin America. I would just say on Latin America, just generally, we're very concerned about lack of U.S. engagement in the region. Part of that stems from focus on U.S.-China relations, on the war in Ukraine, domestic challenges with the economy. But the reality is we're seeing a real shift in the region politically, and we are watching that. We've engaged the new leaders in recent weeks. Neil Harrington, who runs our Latin America office, and myself, we met with a number of the presidents, and we'll continue to work with them on business policies there. But Neil, the question is also on the politics of immigration. Can you give a quick answer to that issue? It's not a quick issue, but thoughts real quick.
Yeah, the politics of immigration are awful. Let's just face it. And it's keeping both sides from doing what virtually everyone agrees needs to be done. We need to do three things. We need to increase legal immigration, so it's easier for people to get into the United States legally, and there are more pathways to do that. We need to secure the border and have a functioning border control. And then three, to the questioner's point and the points you just made, Myron, we need to help those countries who've been destabilized either from political or economic situations to build a domestic economy that stops the push for pushing people, to take dangerous illegal journeys into the United States. Everyone agrees we need to do those three things. The problem is that everyone wants the other side to agree to do their thing first and only their thing. And so we have to overcome that. It's going to be a big focus of ours, particularly in the next 2 years, to try to take advantage of divided government to forge a consensus around those three key pillars.
Well, this ends our session today. Let me just say, first off, to all the AmCham representatives, keep engaging us, keep letting us know what's on your mind. Let us know how we can help you. As I mentioned, this is a priority for the U.S. Chamber. We're one big family. We have clearly a lot of work to do domestically here, as Neil outlined, and overseas. To those of you who asked questions, I hope you felt that you got the response you needed. To Neil, look, Neil has an incredibly important role. I think you just saw the breadth of issue areas that Neil has to think about on behalf of the chamber, working with an incredible team at the chamber. I'm proud to call him not only a colleague, but someone I look to for advice and support. And I know Suzanne really counts on him on so many levels. Look, today you've got a glimpse of why Neil is one of the sharpest strategists in Washington. A lot of those questions he was not prepared for, but he is prepared by nature. And I just want to thank you, Neil, for coming on. Of course, the AmCham community sees you in many different ways. He's one of the most publicly available people, always taking media questions. And I really just want to thank him for being with us today. With that, thank you all. Look forward to hearing more from you about areas you want us to cover, and stay engaged. This is a very interesting but challenging time for us at home and abroad. Thank you very much.
Thank you.